Question is, Josephus mentions Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist. Did he not? Did John the Baptist have any authority? Was he a rabbi, or was he a Jewish authoritative figure at that time? Does he appear in any of the Jewish writings?
We are told about John the Baptist by Josephus when he was a very important figure. The context of the report we have from Josephus, who's our most reliable first century historian, is that John the Baptist, a noted figure, he criticized the Tetrarch Herod for an illicit marriage. And as a result of that, Herod had John the Baptist beheaded, had him executed. And that story is told to us in the Gospels as well. The timing is not identical, but to me, that's just not very interesting. So John the Baptist was traveling around Eretz Yisrael, telling people to repent. This was kind of an apocalyptic preacher, telling people the end of days is coming and it's time to repent. That's the kind of figure he is. There are scholars who think that he was a Nicaean. I don't think the evidence supports that. That's what's key. Now, here is what is very interesting. There is no doubt that Christians who were writing the New Testament wanted to connect Jesus to this very important person, wanted to connect Jesus to someone who was, in fact, a very important figure. And they would do that right from the get-go, and I don't mean from the get-go in Paul, but from the get-go in the Gospels. Mark, chronologically, our earliest Gospel, begins following the incipit with John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. Matthew has even a much more elaborate baptismal scene. And in fact, John the Baptist's speech that he gives is, "Why am I baptizing him?" The thinking is that the person who baptizes someone else should be spiritually superior to the one who's being baptized. Baptize is just a Greek word for dipping or for immersing. As we move forward chronologically in the Gospels, what we would expect to find is precisely what we would anticipate. And that is that later Gospel writers would want to connect Jesus to John the Baptist even more. And that's where we find the massive splash of this in the book of Luke, where John the Baptist is now mishpacha. He's actually cousins with Jesus. Now, how likely is it, just think about this, how likely is it that Jesus was cousins with John the Baptist, and the author of Mark and Matthew didn't think that was a significant enough point to raise? The answer is that even Brown, probably the greatest Christian scholar in the English-speaking world in the latter half of the 20th century, and he was a Christian. He was a professor at Union Theological Seminary. He was a religious man, but he doubted the veracity of Luke's infancy narrative, and he doubted the fact that they were in fact related. But whether they were or not is very clear what the Christian Bible is trying to do, and that is to connect them. John the Baptist is our very significant person. Gospel writers are going to want to connect them together. What we would expect also occurs. That means when you're not telling the truth, when you're connecting Jesus to somebody who was really never connected to him, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. In Matthew chapter 11, for example, John the Baptist is in prison, and he sends two messengers to Jesus to inquire if in fact he is the Messiah, or is it somebody else? Well, how could he not know if Jesus is the Messiah or not? Their family, how could he not know? He already said who he is earlier on. How could he not know in John chapter 1, not in the prologue, but immediately after the prologue, which ends at verse 18. In John 1:31, John also says, "I didn't know him." Now, how could he not have known him when in fact he was the one who baptized him? He was very aware of who he was, according to the soliloquy of John the Baptist. So, in sum, here's what really happened. John the Baptist was not just a real person, he was a person of enormous note. If you wanted to present Jesus as a significant figure, you would connect him to this Jewish celebrity who's very well known. And the gospel writers, using different plot devices, would in fact connect them. However, the fact that John the Baptist does not know who Jesus is, that also creeps into the Gospels. That, no doubt, is an earlier text. And this was all assembled together. How do I know that that's authentic? We use the most rigorous criteria to establish what in the Christian Bible could possibly have been historically accurate. When I talk about the Christian Bible corrupting texts, altering history, employing strange or striking plot devices, that does not mean that nothing described in the Christian Bible is historical. Within fiction, there is often something that is historical. You could even take a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. Well, it was a King Arthur. There are historical features in the Christian Bible, and they appear and they bleed out. And the question then is, how do I pick and choose? By what method does any person examine an ancient text and say, this is extremely likely to have occurred. This is unlikely to have occurred? Well, there are some very rigorous methods that we can use. We could certainly expect verisimilitude. That means, you probably picked up on those two Latin words, we'd expect stories to match, to fit the historical setting, and we sort of do on this case. But we have what's called the criteria of embarrassment, a very rigorous method, where if something is in the Christian Bible and it's embarrassing to the Christian church, it is very likely to have been a historical event. If in the Christian Bible, John the Baptist in prison doesn't know who Jesus is, and he's asking, are you him or not? It's very unlikely that Christian scribes later, even though they knew that John the Baptist knew Jesus very well and makes these huge speeches about how great Jesus is and how he's destined to be the Messiah and he's not even worthy to baptize him. And they would just say, let's just throw something in that John the Baptist doesn't know who he is. It's very unlikely that John 1, 31 through 33, it's very unlikely that someone would have made that up later. Rather, they had to include that somehow later on to account for the fact that people are going, what are you talking about? Jesus and John the Baptist didn't know each other. So therefore, what you find in the Christian Bible is not monolithic. You find both texts that are showing that basically John the Baptist is the opening act for Jesus, very much so. And also, John the Baptist not knowing who Jesus is, uncertain who Jesus is, but was John the Baptist a historical figure? He wasn't just a historical figure. He was a very important personality who no doubt was the star of the first half of the first century. He was already executed before 40, and Christians would seek to connect Jesus to John the Baptist in order to lend credibility to the Christian claims. That's a really great question. Thank you.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם